When discussing the famous Targaryen civil war, many people come to the conclusion that both sides are equally bad, and the moral of this entire story is that you're not meant to root for anyone. Arguments in favor of this reading are that the author of this story is a pacifist, that the story is set in a feudal world where both claimants to the throne are monarchs, and monarchy and feudalism are wrong, or that both sides of the war do morally questionable, often heinous things. It's pretty convenient that these arguments are only brought up in the context of the Dance of the Dragons, and not any other war happening in this universe, where all these aspects are present as well. It's also pretty telling that this is the only war where gender is an important factor. I'm sure that's just a coincidence. So, are the Greens and the Blacks actually equally bad? Is the message of this story truly that you should not root for either side? We will look at these factions from different points of view, examine the arguments in favor of this reading, and make a final conclusion. George R.R. Martin was a young man during the Vietnam War, eligible for being drafted, but he actively refused to get conscripted. He also does not shy away from showing the horrors of war in his story. So in that case, it would seem obvious that if George R.R. Martin is anti-war and thinks war in any possible context is bad, then of course you're not meant to root for either side of the conflict. But in that case, you should apply this reasoning to every single conflict in the books. Stannis is therefore not justified in going to war to reclaim the throne that he believes is rightfully his. Robb Stark isn't justified in going to war against the Lannisters either. After all, he is proclaimed a monarch, and monarchy is bad, as is feudalism, and Robb makes exactly zero effort to abolish it. Not to mention that northern independence is not his to proclaim. He lives on land stolen from the children of the forest, whom his ancestors genocided and settler colonized their territories. Northern independence is quite literally like Texas separatism or Quebec separatism. This isn't your land, so you can't decide to secede. And war is always bad, so he should just accept that the Lannisters killed his father. And after he goes to war, he and his people commit numerous war crimes and atrocities. You think that this argument is stupid? Then how come you use the exact same one against this particular conflict? Stay consistent. George R.R. Martin's recent comments, however, point out that he isn't completely anti-war. He, for example, said that he would like to have a dragon and fly to Kremlin in order to confront Putin for the invasion he launched against Ukraine. Wouldn't that be an action that isn't exactly pacifistic? There is also the famous quote from his book Favorite Dream, where, lo and behold, one of the characters says that while a peaceful solution is preferable, sometimes it is impossible, and that's when fire and blood might be utilized. So it seems to me that Martin thinks that while war generally is bad, it can sometimes be justified if, for example, it brings some progress, like abolishing slavery or perhaps ending male primogeniture that would ultimately bring some rights to women. And that is why I believe that he is on the side of the Black faction and that the readers should side with the Black faction as well. Women's power in Westeros was in decline for some time, and after Rhaenyra it was completely destroyed. The death of dragons affected women the most. This becomes clear if you read Fire and Blood and The World of Ice and Fire and compare the status of women before and after the war. The unification of Westeros was carried out not just by Aegon the Conqueror, but also by his sisters, Rhaenys and Visenya, who were actively involved in the battles and diplomacy. After the success of the campaign, They took part in the administrative affairs of the country, even sitting on the Iron Throne when Aegon was occupied by other matters. The reign of Jaehaerys I was also marked by heavy involvement of his wife Alysanne, but Jaehaerys' attitude towards women was already in stark contrast to Aegon's. Jaehaerys passed over his daughter Daenerys in favor of his son Aemon, which displeased Alysanne, who believed that Daenerys should inherit, considering that she was the older of the two. Succession concerns caused the king to organize the Great Council in the year 101, where two main candidates ended being Viserys, Jaehaerys' oldest male grandson, and Rhaenys, the oldest child of Aemon, who was Jaehaerys' original heir. Viserys was Jaehaerys' preferred candidate, and indeed, Rhaenys ended up being passed over on the basis of her gender, thus earning her the famous title, the Queen Who Never Was. The situation was, it seems, to be reversed when King Viserys' only living heir for a long time was Princess Rhaenyra Targaryen, whom he named as his official successor when she was 8, and refused to alter his choice even after he remarried and had trueborn sons. Yet after Viserys' death, his oldest son Aegon was crowned by his supporters. Rhaenyra refused to accept it, and a bloody civil war followed, in which both claimants to the throne perished. When the war ended, another succession crisis was ahead. The claims of several women were put forward. Jaehaera, the only surviving child of Aegon the Elder, as well as Baela and Rhaena, Daemon Targaryen's daughters, but all of them were dismissed on the basis of their gender, using the newly ended civil war as a justification. So here we have direct proof that the usurpation of Rhaenyra set a certain precedent, that women cannot be accepted as queens because war would follow. The dragons went extinct after the dance, which took away a lot of power women had, which manifested itself by, for example, Baelor the Blessed confining his sisters in the Maiden Vault. It would be close to impossible to do that if, say, Daena the Defiant had a dragon. Yet because she didn't have one, her power as a woman was greatly diminished. Daena was even briefly considered to inherit the throne, but due to her isolation in the Maiden Vault, she had no powerful allies that could support her. People also feared another Dance of the Dragons. Besides, she gave birth to an illegitimate child, so she was wild and wanton. Sounds familiar? The further the worse. By the time of Rhaenys Targaryen, women held zero power and were rendered to be baby machines, used by men however they want, their feelings, wishes and safety ignored. The culmination of it all was the situation Rhaenyra Targaryen found herself in, seeing the worst of Aerys Targaryen, who raped and abused her, and nobody bothered to stop him. So in the span of 3 centuries, we went from women like Visenya and Rhaenys, who were conquerors, just like Aegon, and ruled alongside their brother, to Alysanne, who was Jaehaerys' co-ruler in all but a name, to Rhaenyra, who was usurped and brutally murdered due to a war that started on the basis of her being a woman, to Daena, who was imprisoned for most of her life with no allies, and eventually to Rhaenys and Rhaella, who could only silently endure the abuse that their husbands put them through. Daenerys Targaryen herself was on a straight path for that fate as well, abused her entire life by her brother. She was supposed to marry Viserys and remain at his mercy forever, but he unknowingly handed her some semblance of power, which she was able to expand on, culminating in her waking dragons out of stone, and with the help of said dragons, she launched a continent-wide anti-slavery revolt. Rhaenyra's usurpation, death and failure cemented the precedent of women not being allowed to rule, reversed their rights and forced them to be nothing but baby machines. It was detrimental to the status of all women. Nobody seriously argues that Rhaenyra was a Marxist feminism either, or that her assertion to the throne would grant women equal rights. What is argued instead is that her particular case was a good way to introduce some progress that would gradually help women achieve more equal standing. What happened instead is that all of the power of women was lost, and its opponents now had a powerful excuse on hand. It's silly as hell to expect Rhaenyra to immediately abolish male primogeniture when she's fighting a war, and then presumably industrialize Westeros, oversee the development of the bourgeoisie, only to abolish it so that Westeros turns into a leftist utopia. It is silly and hypocritical if you don't expect characters like Stannis or Robb to do that. I wonder why. By the way people talk about the dance, it would seem like the support for each faction was roughly split in half, but it wasn't. In fact, 53 houses overall supported Rhaenyra, while only 28 supported Aegon. Region-wise, it looks like this. One color seems to prevail. It is an objective fact that most of the kingdom supported Rhaenyra's claim over Aegon's. The Blacks had twice the support than the Greens. Additionally, the Greens are quite boring characters, all things considered. I know that people insist that they like them because they believe them to be somehow more compelling, but that compelling moniker is usually a plausible deniability excuse to side with them in spite of their inherent misogyny. The vast majority of the people who side with the Greens hate the Targaryens even though the Greens are Targaryens themselves. That is because they are detrimental to the house as a whole and are often perceived as Hightowers rather than Targaryens. Often they are even referred to as Stark Towers. In reality, all the Greens being the name Targaryen derive their power from their Targaryenness, and they only ever referred to themselves as such. Notice how Rhaenyra included her husband's and mother's sigils in her personal coat of arms, while Aegon's coat of arms is just his dragon, Sunfire. He did not include his mother's coat of arms or anything of this sort. All the Green children are dragon riders who are proud of this fact, and Aemond himself even claimed the oldest living dragon, the one who conquered Westeros, in order to highlight his Targaryen identity. Funnily enough, the Tark Towers often exemplify the criticism that are usually leveraged at House Targaryen as a whole. For example, their Valyrian features of purple eyes and silver hair were used to undermine Rhaenyra's sons who had brown hair and eyes. In the show, Alicent does not want to betroth the technically illegitimate Jaehaerys to her Valyrian-looking daughter and outright refers to him as plain-featured. Wow, isn't this the blood purity that the Targaryens are supposed to be so obsessed with? Targaryens are accused of using dragons as weapons of mass destruction in order to consolidate absolute power and terrorize anyone who doesn't bend the knee to them, and yet it is Daeron and Aemond who use their dragons to unleash senseless violence on the small folk. But more about that later. Even in the show, the Greens have less characterization, so it's easier to shove whatever headcanons you want on them, or project your issues on them, insist that they were secretly oppressed by Viserys or that they have generational trauma. But the reality is that they are all just losers. Aegon is a pedophile and a sex pest who was crippled by a teenager on a tiny dragon and was eventually poisoned by his own men. Aemond is a war criminal who spent the entire war genociding the Riverlands for no reason, eventually losing to his geriatric uncle. Helaena is a plot device existing to be Sophie choiced to make the black side slightly more morally ambiguous. Daeron loses to a tent. Alicent is a Republican trad. Where's all that compelling things that they are supposedly so full of? If they are so compelling, then surely they would be equally liked to the Blacks, and yet it is Daemon, Rhaenyra and Rhaenys who are favorites among the viewers. Mind you, many aspects of these characters have been added in the show precisely because otherwise they would be nothing but master-twirling villains. There is nothing to indicate that Helaena is an autistic dragon dreamer in the books. Alicent is a decade older than Rhaenyra and calls her a slut when she's like 12, and isn't a poor oppressed little child bride. Aegon does not have daddy issues. Aemond isn't bullied by his brother, quite the opposite, he is the one who bullies Jace, Luke and Joff. So if such drastic changes were made in the show to balance the scales, then the show failed to properly adapt the Greens, right? Therefore, George R.R. Martin, who is usually able to construct extremely complex villains, made a conscious decision to make the Greens so one-dimensional. Wonder what could be the reason, if only we could ever learn that. Even less attention has been given to their supporters. Who do the Greens actually have? Boros Baratheon? Alice Rivers? Where are all the charismatic badass greens? The Black faction, on the other hand, is not only more developed, but also more numerous and, I would say, more charismatic. Daemon himself is described as the greyest character in all of A Song of Ice and Fire, a hero and a monster and one of George R.R. Martin's favorites. Rhaenyra does not conform to the standards imposed on her by society, is allowed to be proud, stubborn and flawed. Per the historians writing Fire and Blood, Jace had what it takes to be a great king. Baela was a warrior who managed to defeat Aegon on a much smaller dragon. Rhaena, her polar opposite, was the last dragon rider before Daenerys. Rhaenys, the queen who never was, fought fiercely to give another woman what was taken away from her. Corlys is the commander of the biggest fleet in Westeros. The Winter Wolves had come from the north to die for the Dragon Queen. Cregan continued fighting for Rhaenyra even after she died, and made it his goal to put her son on the throne. The lads managed to amass a Rivermen army even after Aemon's genocidal campaign. Lesbian icon Sabitha Frey and her bisexual girlfriend Alysanne Blackwood commanded Rivermen armies. Jane Arryn was another lesbian icon, and there are many others that now escape my mind. These people fought for Rhaenyra because they believed in her and continued to fight for her even after her death. They were by all accounts a family, bound not by feudal contract, but by the loyalty they had for one another. In the case of Jane and Cregan, they had additional reasons to support Rhaenyra. They themselves had faced usurpation. Jane's kin tried to usurp her several times, and Cregan's uncle tried to usurp him as well. It's not a coincidence. By the way people talk about the dance, it would seem like both sides were equally awful and responsible for the equal amount of atrocities. But is that the case? Is this really about choosing your favorite war criminal? Let's preface by saying that Aegon's coronation did not directly lead to war. What actually started it were the actions undertaken by Aemond. 14-year-old Lucerys Velaryon was sent as a peace envoy to Storm's End, where he encountered Aemond, who wanted revenge due to the incident from their childhood, where Luke took out his eye. Aemond proceeded to chase Luke on Vhagar, the biggest dragon in the world, while Luke's dragon was barely big enough to lift him up. It was Luke's death that turned the war from a subtle power struggle into a full-fledged conflict. So it was the Greens who started the war. Even Otto told Aemon that he was stupid to do what he did. And here is where we will address Blood and Cheese. After the news of Luke's death, Blood and Cheese were hired by Daemon to take revenge. They broke into the Red Keep and forced Helaena to pick which one of her children will be killed, Jaehaerys or Maelor. Helaena picked Maelor, but Jaehaerys was killed anyway, which eventually drove Helaena to suicide. Now, it is a wonder that the Blood and Cheese event is singled out as the worst act of war, even though it was merely a retaliation for Lucerys' brutal murder. Daemon literally said, "A son for a son," while he knew it was a power move, showing the Greens that they aren't even safe in their own capital. Again, no murder of Luke, no Blood and Cheese. Scarce balance. And I also find it incredible how people cry tears of blood about Blood and Cheese, but make fun of Luke's death and Rhaenyra's grief over it. Rules for thee, but not for me, quite literally. Now we will finally look at various military engagements, who initiated them, and what actions were undertaken during them. For the sake of clarity, I excluded some of the battles where there were no significant atrocities against the civilians. Shortly before the murder of Lucerys, Daemon took Harrenhal without casualties, and most of the Rivermen declared for Rhaenyra, aside from the Brackens, always at the crime scene. That quickly changed after House Blackwood, their eternal enemies who supported the Blacks, sacked their villages. First Team Black war crime. What followed was the sack of Duskendale. Duskendale was attacked by surprise and sacked. First Team Green war crime. Then we move on to Rook's Nest of House Stoughton. That was more difficult since the castle was warned and was able to prepare. Unfortunately, that can't be said about the surrounding areas. Villages were sacked and livestock slaughtered. Second Team Green war crime. Next was the Battle of the Gullet, a sea battle that was won by the Blacks, albeit at a terrible cost. licensed ships that survived sacked Spice Town on their way back and butchered men, women and children. The town was never rebuilt. High Tide, containing all of Corlys's treasures, was burned and servants killed. Third Team Green war crime. Next significant event was the sack of Lannisport, done by Dalton Greyjoy. Hundreds of women and girls were taken as salt wives. Second Team Black war crime. After that, Aemond quite literally decided to genocide the Riverlands. He burned various settlements, and when Sir Criston Cole was going south, he found everything in front of him dead. Forests, villages, horses, men. After Criston's death, Aemond continued to terrorize the Riverlands. Fourth Team Green war crime. Next was the sack of Bitterbridge. Daeron burned the town. Hundreds of wounded died and townspeople were cut down by Hightower soldiers or forced into the Mander to drown. Lady Caswell yielded her castle and then hanged herself from the gatehouse. Hightowers spared her children, but ordered the entire castle remaining garrison to be killed. Fifth Team Green war crime. Then followed the First Battle of Tumbleton. Daeron burned thousands of people to death or forced them to drown while trying to cross the river. Later the town was sacked and girls as young as 8 were raped by the victors. Tumbleton was quite literally wiped off the map and never recovered. Sixth Team Green war crime. So we can see clear as day that the Greens committed many unspeakable atrocities. The worst thing Team Black did was Dalton's kidnapping the women to be salt wives, whereas Team Green kept burning the Riverlands over and over again and wiped Tumbleton off the map, engaging in rape of little girls. Therefore, the Greens are much, much, much worse in that regard. By the end of the Civil War, both claimants to the throne perished. Rhaenyra was killed by Sunfire and Aegon was poisoned by his own men. Aegon had 3 legitimate children, Jaehaerys, Jaehaera and Maelor. Jaehaerys was killed by Blood and Cheese and Maelor was killed by a mob when he was being smuggled to safety. Thus Aegon's only remaining descendant was Princess Jaehaera. All of his other siblings died as well. Helaena committed suicide, Aemond was killed by Daemon, and Daeron lost to it. Rhaenyra had 3 children with her first husband, Sir Laenor Velaryon, Jaehaerys, Lucerys and Joffrey. Lucerys was killed by Aemond when he went to Storm's End as a peace envoy. Jaehaerys died in the Battle of the Gullet. Joffrey died during the storming of the Dragon Pit. Additionally, Rhaenyra had 2 sons with Daemon Targaryen. Aegon, referred to as Aegon the Younger as to not confuse him with his uncle, and Viserys. Viserys went missing and was presumed dead after the Battle of the Gullet. Thus, it was presumed that Aegon the Younger was the only living descendant of Rhaenyra. Jaehaera and Aegon the Younger were briefly married in order to settle the dispute. However, one day Jaehaera fell out of the window on the spikes in front of Maegor's Holdfast and died. She was Aegon the Elder's last living descendant. It is widely believed that Alwyn Peake was behind Jaehaera's murder, as he had hoped to marry his own daughter to Aegon the Younger. His plans did not succeed and Aegon the Younger remarried with Rhaenyra Velaryon. Mind you, Alwyn Peake was a Green, and yet that did not stop him from killing his liege's last surviving descendant. As such, the Green line ended. People who prefer the Green faction are very upset about Jaehaera, insisting that narratively this is the worst aspect of the dance, makes the least sense, that it would be better to have Jaehaera the mother of Aegon's children, that Rhaenyra came out of nowhere and so on. Of course they have to believe that. If the warring factions had been united like it happened after the Wars of the Roses, then surely the message would be that both sides had a point and that eventually unity and peace prevailed. But that didn't happen. Jaehaera not only dies, but is killed when the Green faction begins cannibalizing itself, and with her death, the line of Aegon the Elder dies. Which is doubly ironic, considering that Aegon the Elder specifically insisted that Rhaenyra's line must end, and he even wanted to geld Aegon the Younger to prevent him from having offspring, or send him to the Night's Watch. Yet it is his descendants that die, and his line that does not continue. Through Aegon the Younger and Viserys, who was later found to be alive after all, the Black Line continued. Rhaenyra and Daemon are the ancestors of characters like Daenerys Targaryen, Jon Snow, Rhaegar Targaryen, Robert Baratheon, Stannis Baratheon, Renly Baratheon, Oberyn Martell, Elia Martell, Doran Martell, Aryan Martell, and Aegon Blackfyre. There is some possibility that Daemon is also the ancestor of Margaery Tyrell and Loras Tyrell, considering that Margaery's mother is a Hightower and Rhaena herself married a Hightower. It's pretty significant how both claimants to the throne die and what happens afterwards. Rhaenyra is betrayed and devoured by Sunfire, but as she dies, she screams one last curse at Aegon the Elder. Aegon, however, is poisoned by his own men. Instead of fighting for Jaehaera's claim to the throne, Anwyn Peake kills her. On the other side, Rhaenyra's supporters continue to fight even after she dies. Cregan Stark does everything in his power to put Rhaenyra's son on the throne, and he succeeds, not abandoning her cause when it was convenient for him. I often hear that the point of the dance is that nobody won, but that's not true. The Blacks were vindicated in the end. Their line continued, the dynasty continued through them, they remained united even after their leader died. This is why Jaehaera's death upsets so many Greens. Her death is the final nail in the coffin for the Green cause.
Is there even such a thing as a hero and a villain in this story for our group?
Well, it depends on how you define those terms. We're not going to have, anyone who's called Lord Evil or Mr. Atrocity or anything like that, and we don't have orcs or Trollocs or any like that. But there's certainly evil. I always believed in the most interesting characters are great characters, like all the human beings I've ever met and read about, who are capable of generosity and love and doing good, and then the next week they do something selfish and bad, and we all have things to be proud of, we all have things to be ashamed of, and to my mind, I'll quote once again William Faulkner, who in his Nobel Prize acceptance speech said, "The only thing that's worth writing about is the human heart in conflict with itself," and that's something I've always taken as a mantra here. That all of these characters, have good in them, have evil in them, and it's a matter of what choices they make. And I like the fact that the readers of Fire and Blood divided as to who actually is the hero and who actually is the villain, and I hope the viewers of the show will have the same issues here. We probably should have seated this audience with greens on one side and blacks on the other.
We're not there yet, George.
Okay.
We're very united right now. The crowd is very united. Everybody is very happy. We don't want a war within the audience.
So we'll do that next year.
Yes.
Right. Okay.
This clip is often used as proof that George R.R. Martin does not want you to take sides, but taking into account all of the things that I just went over, does he really? I mean, he describes Daemon almost the same way, and I sincerely have trouble finding any positive aspects of the Greens. A common complaint about them is that they are master-twirling villains. But even with that in mind, people insist that the Dance of the Dragons is nuanced. The Green cause relies entirely on misogyny, and they are responsible for far more terrible crimes. What human conflict in the heart is there? This conflict relies on an already existing precedent of overlooking female heirs, and it all but solidified it. The only reason why people believe that the dance is nuanced is because the core of it is misogyny and because Targaryens are involved. That's why the same people who insist that there was no right side act outraged about Renly usurping Stannis. That's why people are able to talk about how monarchy is wrong and everyone did war crimes without applying it to Robb and the Lannisters. Monarchy suddenly isn't wrong when Robb declares independence, usurpation is wrong when two men are involved. And if George R.R. Martin indeed wrote a clearly gendered story only to conclude that everyone was in the wrong, then honestly, fuck him. Thanks for watching. If you like this video, please leave a like, subscribe and share so that more people can see it too. Make sure to click the notification button so that you never miss a new video.